Happy Friday, wargamers! Today we're going to be going over all the basics of working with blue foam. Today I'm going to be walking you through the basics of using extruded polystyrene. Now, extruded polystyrene is often called blue foam or pink foam, and it usually comes in sheets like this. It's very rigid. You can't compress it all that much with your fingers, and it's not to be confused with expanded polystyrene. Now this is usually white in colour, and it's made of lots of little balls that are glued together and compressed. You usually find it for things like packing materials. Now expanded polystyrene, which is this stuff, is great for making hills or building up a substructure that you're going to clad or that you're going to texture over. But it's no good really for making detailed buildings or structures that you want to put fine work into. Another option for building up hills and big structures like that is building insulation. Now this stuff is tough. Not quite as dense as extruded polystyrene, there's still quite a bit of give to it, but it is great for building up hills and rock clusters and things like that, because you get big thick sections of it and you can get it really cheap. In fact, I got this and an entire cupboards full for free by going down to my local hardware store and just asking if I could rummage through their bins. But today we're going to be talking about extruded polystyrene. I'm going to be walking through how to work with this material, how to cut it, how to texture it, all the tips and tricks that you need to be able to make awesome looking terrain with this stuff. Before we start though, a few safety concerns. When cutting extruded polystyrene, make sure you're using a very sharp blade, because not only will a dull blade leave a terrible cut, it's also much more likely to veer off and cut you. Also, when sanding or using heat to deform the material, make sure you're doing it in a well ventilated area. Get that window open, turn on some fans if you've got them, and make sure to wear a dust mask or a respirator. This stuff will give off tiny particles that are not good for your lungs, and same with your eyes as well. It's worth wearing some eye protection to stop those particles getting into your eyes. But with the safety concerns out of the way, let's head over to the bench and get started working with this material. So here we have a sheet of extruded polystyrene. You can see that I've already cut into this one. But there are two main thicknesses that I work with when using extruded polystyrene. 10mm, which is this size, and 6mm. 10mm is a really good base for building up structures like buildings, and 6mm is a really good size for adding detailing. Before we get started, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the tools that we'll be using on this material. Most importantly is a craft knife. You can see here that I've got a brand new packet of craft knives, and the reason being you want as sharp blade as possible when working with this material. So I recommend every time you start a new project and every sort of 30 minutes of cutting you do, get a brand new blade, because you want them to be as sharp as possible. Now, if you don't want to keep burning through these disposable craft knives, you can pick up a blade sharpener, and I'll leave a link in the description below to one. That way you can just buy one pack and just sharpen them every time you use them. Other than the craft knife, another great thing that we're going to be using is a wire brush. Now, small wire brushes like this are great for adding some broken texture to our foam pieces, and I'll be showing you how to do that a little bit later on. Another key material is sandpaper. Now I use a sanding block, but you can use sandpaper on its own. It's great, not just for removing the natural texture of the foam if you want to add your own texture, but also for smoothing down areas and adding shape to your piece. And moving on to the advanced tools, one of the most versatile tools that you can have as a hobbyist is a rotary tool. This is great for all sorts of hobby applications, but for when it comes to foam, it's great for using these little sanding drums to shape it, or you can use some of these smaller bits to add weathering and distress the foam. When it comes to gluing foam, there's nothing that can beat a good quality PVA glue. or wood glue or white glue, depending on what it's called in your area. I use the brand Everbuild because I find that it has great adhesion, it sticks the foam together really well, and it tacks the pieces in place fairly quickly. Another option is to use super glue. Now, you want to be careful when you're using super glue with foam because it can eat the foam, it can dissolve the foam, the chemicals in the glue. So I usually use super glue to add a few drops to tack the foam to just hold it there while the PVA dries. So with our basic tools and materials out of the way, let's get started on working with the foam. The first thing I'm going to show you today is how to make cuts on your foam. As I said earlier, you want to start with a very sharp blade. And you can see here that I've marked out on a piece of foam several squares that we're going to use as test pieces today. Now, what you want to do is take your metal ruler, line it up with the mark you've made, and then the angle that you hold the blade at is very important. Instead of holding it at a sharp angle, you want to make sure to hold it at a shallow angle like this, so that as much of the blade is in contact with the foam at all times as possible, and you'll get a better cut like that. It's also incredibly important to make sure that you keep your blade straight at a 90-degree angle to the work surface, because this will give you a much better cutting result. So what I'm going to do now is going to start making the cuts, and you'll see what I do first is just make a light score in the top of the foam. And I do this 2 or 3 times. What this does is makes a mark for your blade to follow, and also cuts part way through that foam so that the blade doesn't have such a hard job. And then once that's done, I just put my blade all the way through, keeping it as straight as possible, keep the angle as shallow as possible, and just in one motion cut straight through. And then do this for any cuts you need to make. I'm going to cut out all of these pieces and we'll come back. If you want to make curved cuts, much of the process is the same. You want to make sure to keep your blade at a 90-degree angle to your work surface and not hold it at any other angle. And you want to make sure your blade is as sharp as possible. Then all you need to do is in one motion come in, if possible try and start off of your piece, like put the tip of your blade onto your cutting mat, away from your work surface, away from your work piece, and then in one move come through. And you'll see that it gives quite a nice finish. A little bit of tearing here at the end, but overall it's a really nice finish. And there's a little bit of a bevel on it. Maybe you'll be able to see if I hold it like this. There's a little bit of a bevel on it, but it's not too extreme. For the best results when cutting, really the only option is to use a hot wire cutting table. What this is like a hot wire cutter, but it's suspended in a table, so the wire itself is always straight and you have a straight and level surface to move your workpiece around on. You can get these for about £30. I'll leave a link in the description to where you can find one. And if you're going to be doing a lot of foam work, say you're going to be building the buildings for an entire table, it's really worth the investment because you'll get much better results, far cleaner cuts and more precise measurements by using a hot wire cutter. But as you can see, if you don't have one available, you can get good results with the blade, but it's just something to bear in mind. The next thing we're going to talk about is gluing your piece. Now, as I mentioned in the materials list, I use Everbuild wood adhesive because I find it to give the best results for me personally, but you'll have to have a look and see what brands of glue are available in your area. I recommend not using the cheap PVA glue that they market for kids craft projects, because those tend to be pre-watered down and they don't have a very good adhesion. So you'll often find that you'll glue your two pieces together and they'll just come straight apart. For the example, I'm going to be gluing this square piece down onto this offcut here. There are two ways you can do this. You can either just run a bead of PVA and press it down and leave it, or what you can do is you can take some super glue, add just a couple of drops to the end after putting on your PVA glue. And what this does is once you press it down, the super glue will tack the piece in place to stop it from moving when the PVA is setting up. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to take my PVA glue and I'm just going to run a bead of it along, I hope, if it's not clogged. There we go. Just going to run a bead of it along. And you can see this PVA glue is very thick, which is one of the reasons why I like it. And then just a couple of dabs of super glue on the ends and then press the piece into place. Hold it there for 10 to 20 seconds to give the super glue enough time to dry, and then we should be able to take our fingers away, and you can see the super glue has tacked it into place, and then the PVA will have a chance to set. What I like to do then is to just take a small offcut and come in and just smooth out the glue like that. Just drag it along and smooth it out. Another thing I do if I want to ensure a very strong bond is I'll come in with some glue after the piece has been placed. I will run a bead over the connection like that, and then come in with my offcut and wipe away the excess. Now all this does is it just forces a little more glue down into that gap and helps it to bond. The only time that you don't want to do this is obviously it leaves a residue, and if you don't want any residue on your piece, if you want it nice and clean, you can come in with a piece of paper towel and wipe some of it away, but you're never going to get all of it. And if you want a really pristine look, then skip this step. But for most things, it's worthwhile just adding a little extra bead and smoothing it off just to make a nice strong bond. So now we can just put this aside and it'll dry nice and strong. And the final glue option is the hot glue gun. Now, similar to the super glue, I recommend using the hot glue gun to tack your pieces into place instead of applying a long bead. The reason for this is hot glue doesn't thin out as nicely as PVA glue does, so you're often left with a gap. You can get around this if you're only using a small amount and put quite a lot of pressure down. You'll push all the excess out to the sides and then you can clean that up. But for the most part, use the hot glue just to tack in place and then use PVA glue for the majority of the piece. So if you're gluing large sheets down, for example, say you were using foam to create a cobblestone floor for a fantasy piece, you might want to put a few dabs of hot glue down and then the rest as PVA glue, just so that the hot glue tacks that foam sheet down so it doesn't shift while the PVA glue dries. You want to be careful with how hot the glue is as well, because some hot glue guns run very, very hot and they will melt the foam. So always do a test with a scrap piece. Try just gluing two pieces together and gluing a piece down onto whatever material you're using as a base. I like to use expanded PVC plastic for the base. It's also called, I think, Foamex and Sintra. It makes a really good base that doesn't warp, but you can also use MDF or your preferred basing method. But do a test, put some hot glue down on your base, place your foam down and see how it reacts with your particular hot glue gun. And now that we've talked about glues, it's time to move on to one of the most fun parts about working with extruded polystyrene, and that is engraving it. So I've got one of our small squares here that we did earlier, and for this I'm just going to turn it into a flagstone tile. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a ruler and my permanent marker so I don't create indents, and I'm just going to measure in and measure out 4 1-inch squares. So I've added the marks, and the next step is to take my sharp knife, and what we're going to do is using the ruler as a straight edge, like so. We're going to score along the surface of the foam. Now you only want to go a few millimeters in with this, not all the way through, but just drag your knife over the surface. And already I can tell that this knife is getting dull because it's not moving through the foam as nicely as it should, and you can hear it sort of tearing at the foam. So what I'm going to do is just swap out to a new knife because I don't have a sharpener on hand. So I'll just take my fresh blade and then come in from the other side. And straight away I can feel there's much less resistance for this. So I've scored along both of the lines that I've marked, and now I'm going to take a pencil and I'm just going to trace over those lines, pressing the nib of the pencil into the gap that's been created by the knife. And what that does is it widens that gap and creates a really nice indent. You can see there that it gives a really nice effect. Now this picks up paint really well, and you can just go over it 2 or 3 times to get a really deep engraving. Once more, like that. Now there's several things you can do from here. You can leave it how it is and go straight on to painting, or you can add some weathering, which is what we're going to do next. Now we're going to add in some cracks, and the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to take our permanent marker and we are going to mark a few cracks. So about there. Whenever you're marking cracks, always try and go from end to end because it gives a much more realistic effect rather than having a crack stop in the centre of a brick or a flagstone. About the only time that you'd want it to stop in the centre is if you're working on, for example, a modern or a sci-fi piece and you had a bullet hole, a large bullet hole in the centre. You might have cracks emanating out from that, but they would always go to the edge of the piece. It looks much more realistic that way. So with our crack drawn on, we're just going to come in with the blade and just make our mark like that. I've just done one shallow pass and then I'll widen that with a pencil, and then I'm going to come back in and make that crack deeper. The reason I'm doing this is because it's a curved piece, it can be quite hard to move the knife around. So if you make a shallow pass first, then widen it with a pencil, it gives the knife more room to move. And then just come back in with the pencil again, and you can see that you've made the crack. Another really good thing to do for pieces like this one, where it's cracked, is change the depth of them. To do this, we'll just use the eraser on the back of the pencil and just press the piece down. You can be quite firm with this. The foam is high density, so it will spring back a little bit, but just make several passes and push it down so that it's lower than the surrounding pieces. Doing this will mean that the crack you've put in is not as pronounced, so just come back in with your blade again and follow your line, and then again come in with your pencil and widen that back out, and that just makes sure that there's plenty of definition there to be picked up by your paint. Now this technique leaves a very clean cut, which might be what you're looking for, but if you're working on a fantasy piece often looks better if things aren't quite so neat. So what I like to do is come in with a sculpting tool. This is just one of the old GW ones, and take the flat side and just push the corners of the flagstones in. Work it down into the gaps and push the corners in. And then I also like to come along the edge, push the edge in so it's not quite so sharp, like so, along all the edges, like so. You may not be able to pick this up on the camera, but in real life what this does is it makes the flagstones look a little more rough and ready and a little less machined, which is really good if you're going for a fantasy look. And whilst I'm doing that, I'm also just going to widen that gap a bit and use the back of this to round off inside the crack. You don't want to go overboard with this because you can end up distorting the foam and tearing it, but just coming along, widening a few of the gaps and taking off the sharp corners goes a long way. I think we'll add one more crack maybe up here, and as you can see, what we're left with is a really nice result with different heights and plenty of definition that the paint will run into when we come to painting. So with that done, I'll now show you how to texture your piece. For this one, what we want it to look like stone. So the first thing we need to do is remove the base texture. To do this, I'm just going to take a piece of sandpaper. I've got an old piece here, and I'm just going to run my piece over the sandpaper. What that's done is it has removed the texture of the foam, and it gives us a blank canvas to work with. Now, to simulate the texture of stone, what I've got are several pieces of actual stone. I've got a piece of stone and a few pieces of concrete and brick, and all we're going to do is we're just going to press into the surface. Hopefully you'll be able to see there that it's created an impression. You can be quite hard with this, and don't worry too much about creating deep divots because those will spring back a little bit over time anyway. So just push your stone in, try and rotate the side you're using so you don't get a uniform texture, press it down, and then I like to finish off with the end of this stone because it's got a nice natural texture, and I just press it down into my piece and then do the same on the lower portions. And what you're left with, if you can see, is a really nice natural texture. It's subtle, but it's enough to take the foam from looking like an obviously manufactured material to looking like a piece of stone on your wargame table. That's not the only thing you can do with texturing though. I'll bring in a blank piece. If you want to create concrete structures for modern or sci-fi games, you can leave the foam bare because it does have quite a nice texture, quite a subtle texture that will pick up dry brushing quite nicely. But if you want something a little more damaged, for ruins for example, you can take a wire brush and just brush the surface. Even a light pass will leave quite a distinct texture on it, and using that on ruins gives a really nice end result. But if you want something that's really beaten down, you can go in and go much heavier. And you can remove quite a lot of material quite quickly doing this, so do be careful. But it gives quite a distressed texture that looks really great on things like ruins. Now that we've textured our piece, we want to move on to sealing, and you can see that I've used a piece of old newspaper here just to protect my work surface. The reason that we seal the foam is because we want to give it a little bit of protection, but also you can't use spray can paints, aerosol paints, on the foam without sealing it, because there's a good chance the solvent in the spray can will dissolve the foam. So we seal it just so that if you want to be able to use a spray primer, you can do, but it's a good idea to do regardless. So all we're going to do is we're going to take a small amount of PVA glue mixed with water. Now the ratio you use for this will depend on the glue you're using, but you want the PVA glue to be liquid enough just to flow. And then you just come in with an old brush and just brush the surface with the PVA. Making sure to get into all of the little nooks and crannies, because you don't want to miss any. And then just leave this to completely dry, and then we'll move on to painting. I began with an undercoat of black and then dry brushed several lighter shades of grey over the entire piece, making sure to catch all of the raised areas and all of the edges to give a nice highlighted effect. And here you can see the end result. We've got the natural texture of the foam, the brush texture, the stone method, and then finally our engraved piece with the stone method applied. Now I've used quite harsh contrasting tones of greys here just so it picks it out on the camera. But you can see, particularly with the engraved version, that all of that detail gets picked out really nicely and all of the crevices are really defined. Possibilities for what you can do with this material are almost endless, and over the next few weeks we're going to be showing you loads of different methods for both modern / sci-fi as well as fantasy pieces. And there we have it. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to working with blue foam. Next week we're going to be building a set of simple urban ruins that's going to let you get a large volume of terrain on your table really quickly. So if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button. In the meantime, post in the comments below and let us know what sort of terrain you would like to make with blue foam, and if there are any tutorials you'd like to see us do with blue foam, put them in the comments below. And don't forget, you can check out plenty of our other wargaming videos like this one by going onto our channel. And until next time, happy wargaming!